Spore is this really epic journey from cellular life all the way to spacefaring race.
Spore ultimately is the most creative tool and game that you'll have ever played.
Spore is fundamentally a game where the user creates the world that they experience.
I think of Spore as representing the broadest possible perspective on life.
Spore is many things.
Spore is explosive.
Imagination.
Revolutionary. A lot of creativity.
Spore is awesome.
A surprise.
Imagination.
Community infrastructure.
So big. Creativity.
It's always surprising.
Spore is evolution.
Sharing.
It's imagination.
It's fun.
Enormous.
It's enormous.
Powerful slightly.
It's exciting. Cool. It's a blast.
A lot of fun.
It's an experiment.
My family.
Massive.
It's awesome.
Huge.
Creative.
It's everything.
Right now, Spore's crazy.
Will had been asked to write a piece for Wired magazine, just come up with a game concept, I think they asked him to do. Basically, he used that as an opportunity to write down the idea for Spore, but this is well before it had been percolated through the studio or through EA. But it was this idea of a game where you evolve a society from its very early beginnings into space.
I'd finished up SimCity 3000. I was art directing that, and Will had finished up the first cut at The Sims 1. We were at a kind of a little party afterwards, and I said, "So Will, you finished up The Sims. You've done a game about people, and what are you going to do next?" And Will said, "Well, he had an idea about a game that would be about everything else," and I thought he was joking.
And it literally meant everything. He's working on the entire world, the entire galaxy in a box. So yeah, they didn't undersell it at all.
When we first started on Spore, I was initially calling it Sim Everything, but there was, we'd been using Sim titles for all of our games, and it was kind of like the idea of doing something that didn't have Sim in front of it.
And we wanted a good secret name for the project so that we could have our little secret clubhouse where we referred to it by its secret word and we'd be the only ones who would know.
And Ocean just kind of threw out Spore, let's call it Spore. And so that was our code name for the project for a long time. Spore kind of has this connotation. First of all, it sounds like it's about life. It sounds like it's something that wants to spread, and as you're making stuff in the game, it's spreading to all the other players. And really, the game, in some sense, is about life. It's looking at the universe. But the interesting thing about Spore is the way life profoundly affects this fairly mechanistic clockwork universe.
Will's kind of unique in terms of how he really starts to work on a new concept. He does a tremendous amount of reading. In the case of Spore, he's had a lifelong fascination with space, with science. He does a tremendous amount of reading in that territory. And while we were finishing up The Sims Online, he was already having this inkling of an idea of where he wanted to go next.
I'd always been very interested since a kid in astronomy, and I'd never done a space game before. And in particular, I love the idea of this entire galaxy, that I could explore, that would have this, just wonderful variety of worlds from the very, very small microscopic up to the very large kind of intergalactic.
The development team on Spore has really gone through, different phases. It was an extremely small team for a long time, working just with Will. That was really kind of Will just forming up his ideas.
He had a bunch of interns working with him, and basically they were making a bunch of really fun, interesting prototypes that would explore this gameplay for this other idea he had. But they were kind of like the mad scientists in the backgrounds.
And they were basically just trying a lot of things and trying to gel what the actual complete concept of Spore could be, and convince themselves also that we could actually make that game.
I think there was really kind of two battles here. What was the game design in terms of how we're bringing together player content and creativity, but the other side is how do we make the theme of the game, the presentation of it, seem like a universal theme that anybody, would feel like they would want to play.
Our first task was to look at this broad notion of Spore and try to map it down into something that we thought was possible. One way of conceiving of making games is the designer has this very clear idea in their head of exactly what they want. They tell you, you go make it. This is not at all how Spore was made.
You know, you didn't really see them making a lot of game, but you'd be able to go over and see that they were having fun and they were, you know, really just exploring the possibility space of what they could create.
They basically made a series of smaller prototypes, really small pieces, like a little evolution sim, a gravitational simulator of a solar system, a gravitational simulator of a galaxy. They'd made all these things in OpenGL as separate applications, and they'd sort of glued it all together into one monstrosity of a powers of 10. So you could just start out at the single-celled organism, just keep wheeling, you know, using the mouse wheel and keep pulling back and pulling back and pulling back. We were totally a skunkworks project. Like, no one outside of Maxis knew a damn thing about Spore. So our reveal, the place where we went from being no one had ever heard of Spore to everybody was really wanting it, was at GDC.
It was a packed audience, and Will hadn't told them what the presentation was going to be about.
I'd like to start by also apologizing for the title of this talk and the description.
Or he actually had a name for the presentation, but had absolutely nothing to do with what he ultimately showed.
This year when they asked me what I was going to talk about, I just flat out lied.
It was something obscure like the future of creativity in games, or it was the future of content.
So I'm never really going to talk about the future of content.
What he showed was a rough demo of Spore.
Sitting in that room, it was at the Game Developers Conference, and watching the crowd and hearing the crowd react to the first time they saw Spore absolutely sent chills down my spine.
Once he had shown, you know, going from one level to the next, going from cell to creature and then to tribe, and as he kept zooming out, you could hear audible gasps.
As one, they took a breath and went,
He pulls back from the planet and like goes to visit another planet and like blows up the planet, and like the guy in the row in front of us stands up and starts bowing.
You know, people got on their feet, gave him like a 5-minute standing ovation because the idea was just so startling and fresh, and they all got it.
It was complete mayhem. We had people coming up to us going, "Are you really making that?"
Everybody was pretty much thinking, oh, they're almost done, great, we'll be seeing this in a few years. But I mean, that demo is built around a couple strong pieces of technology we had, and you know, Will is a wizard when it comes to the demo.
So like the whole purpose of that demo was to communicate what Spore was, both to us and to our future players, and to the EA executive.
So I remember the first time I actually pitched Spore to the EA execs. And so I kind of came in, I had some slides, and I kind of went through my 15, 20-minute spiel about how cool Spore is going to be and why. And I could see on everybody's faces that they just had no idea what I was talking about. I mean, you know, I'm not even sure I did.
You don't work for Will Wright, you work with Will Wright.
First of all, he is really jaw-droppingly, amazingly smart and inventive and creative. He just thinks about things differently. He's always the person in the room who's going to ask the question that comes kind of out of left field.
You go to lunch with Will and like you have no idea what you're going to end up talking about by the end of lunch. You know, it's robots, it's the Soviet space program, it's, you know, whatever the napkin's made out of.
When you work with him, you go through really different stages. And when he starts a game or a new concept, or, you know, he really takes sort of this world system, and he's done this a number of times. Cities, people, ants, and he's kind of broken them down into these mechanics and then put them back together in a way that people can really interact with. They become toys. The game team itself didn't kick off until we really hired in some people, and it was all about engaging in the core technologies.
So the core team was, when I got here, was mostly engineers. I think a lot of our technology was in pretty serious development at that time, and I think we had more engineers than any other game developer. We had a lot of designers that also could code, which was really, you know, amazing, because like a designer could come up with an idea for a prototype and then go, you know, turn something out to show their idea to everyone to see if it held water, if it was going to be something we'd want to use.
The way our team is structured is we have a lot of very talented people, and we've tried as much as possible to distribute the design decisions down through the whole team. So just about anybody on the team is free to kind of jump into a design discussion and offer their opinion or alternative.
Some of the emphasis of Spore is all about tapping into player creativity. Our position was we wanted players to be as creative as they possibly could. The creators, where they get to make their own creatures or their buildings or vehicles, are all about tapping into that player creativity and giving them no constraints.
Most people, they might have a little bit of experience moving through a 3D world in a game, But in terms of actually creating 3D assets, that was something that we basically had to make seem not only easy to use, but actually fun.
Our sort of fundamental editors are the creature editor, putting parts on a creature, and we have the building editor making structures, and the vehicle editor. The creature editor was a really tight collaboration with the artist in saying, hey, we're going to have this body, we're going to have bones, you can stick like a shoulder or an elbow, and we got to figure out, what do we put on this?
In a typical video game, most characters are created in Maya or some other similar application by an artist. Characters usually have a bunch of like bones and textures and geometry that gets modeled over the process of a few days or a week. And what we do is compress that whole experience down into a few clicks of the mouse.
The idea was, they wanted to go from 0 to smile in 3 clicks.
The system that we've created in Spore lets a player that's never created anything like that before create it in just minutes.
When we first started letting players make creatures, we realized that they were having more trouble than I expected them to have with limbs. So we realized we needed to make a palette of limbs.
If you look at the creatures that we've got now in our creature editor, there's a lot of structure to them. So instead of having an individual section of bone that you have to create a whole creature out of, there's pre-assembled limbs, and you can grab a whole limb, and the system knows what a limb is.
When you see a player who's never used the editor before, they go in and they want to put an arm on the creature. They can.
Yeah, we had to be quite careful about how we picked the individual parts so that when the player put them together, you always got like a unified look.
There was like a really tight back and forth with the artist. For instance, on the parts we have the handles which you deform them, and that came from the art side saying, hey look, we're going to be making these parts in Maya, and artists are going to make them, but we still want the player to have control over them.
A classic example of a problem that we had with the editors was, like in the creature editor, there's this torso, there's this sort of blob that you're putting legs and arms onto. Well, we had the problem of how do you manipulate that? How do you move it around? And so I remember one day we were talking about this, and I said, the spine should be just like my belt. And I whipped my belt off and I slapped it down on the table. And I'm like, well, it should be like this. You grab a part of the belt and you move it around. Like that kind of physical analogy then became the basis for how the spine works. So now you grab the spine and you can drag it around, you middle mouse wheel to make it wider and thicker.
I actually had my mom try the editors, and there were certain things that definitely confused her, and there were certain things that she understood. But it was good user testing experience, because if your mom gets something, then you know that it's right.
We knew that it would be a real game when we were able to create the first real character, when we were able to basically make something that looked like a professional 3D model character that had a real presence and was textured and moved around. The moment that we first brought a creature to life, in a sense, it was sort of a Dr. Frankenstein moment, when you said it's alive.
One of the challenges of Spore was keeping the player connected to their creature throughout the game.
When you add a part to a creature, it'll sort of realize that you've added this part, and what that does is it brings the creature to life and it gives it emotion, so that if you pull its arm off and it kind of hangs its head and it's sad, you kind of feel for it and you want to put the arm back on. Or when you put a new mouth on the creature and it sort of tries it out and does a roar, you really can relate to it a lot more. That brings an emotional element to it.
So not only is the player customizing the way their creature looks or the way their spaceship looks, but they're molding their creature's experience by how they play the game. Every choice that they make can have effects in later levels. How you decide to befriend a tribe or conquer a tribe makes an impact on what abilities you'll have in space.
Essentially everything that you can do, so whether the way you fight, the way you socialize, the way you eat, is all defined by the parts that you had. So if you put a carnivorous mouth on, you have to eat meat. If you put a herbivorous mouth on, you have to eat fruit. And I think that's the heart and soul of creature game, this idea that I made something and now my game changes because of the way I made my creature. I think that's a much stronger game and a much more interesting thing to build than to just say, I have predefined things I can do and I can make something that looks different.
The editors are the thing that we have spent the most effort getting to be perfect. I mean, we've been doing user testing on those for the last 4 years. That kind of, it just feels effortless, is the result of just constant polish and iteration and improvement.
As we get into like the technology stuff, I had to have some very serious programmers that could go in and solve fundamental problems that had not been solved before. Chris Hecker was brought in to work on the animation system, which probably was the single hardest technical problem we faced in Spore. We did a lot of research finding out what the state of the art in this was, and there was very, very little work in this actually. And I think we've probably advanced the state of the art by several years in procedural animation.
I think that the easiest way to describe what proceduralism in the sense that Spore means it is, we have to teach the computer how to do something. With Spore, the things that we save out onto the DVD that you install on your computer are not these fixed recipes anymore. They're kind of lessons for the computer to learn how to do the thing itself in some very hand-wavy sort of way.
There's a whole pipeline under the hood. In most games you have thousands and thousands of dollars worth of artists' tools. The artists use those tools and they manually get all the content, from the 3D authoring app into the game. There's engineers who are responsible for shepherding that data through at every stage, and it's a big part of making a game. In contrast, in a game like Spore, all that stuff has to take place automatically and on the fly, internally inside the game. We have to be able to build the geography of the world, the terrain, the oceans and the mountain ranges, and we have about half a second to build that world. And we have to build all the buildings and vehicles. We have to populate the whole world of the creatures. That might take another couple of seconds. So we've got, maybe 8 seconds, maybe 10 seconds to go from nothing to a world with weather and plants and cities and vehicles driving around and creatures living on it. So we've got these tiny little recipes for creating a building. So when the player creates a building, what they're really doing is they're writing a recipe for creating a building. And the recipe gets sent to everyone else who's playing the game. So the player in the background downloads a recipe for a creature, and then we have to reconstitute that recipe as a creature at the level where the player needs to see it in, half a second or a second or so.
We were taking script, so we were creating worlds and planets using text, basically. It seems really primitive, but what it allowed us to do was do things with very little data. So you could essentially, by writing a script, you could sort of direct our particle system into constructing this terrain.
In Spore, we're sort of, in some sense, teaching the computer to fish for all of these things. How do you generate a mesh? How do you make an animation across, work across multiple creatures and things like that? The programming becomes sort of this teaching process of the computer as opposed to this telling it how it is.
But, that's something that involves kind of deep, scary voodoo math. It's kind of thing where you just kind of put, a couple really sharp guys on it and sit back and give them a year and cross your fingers and hope for the best. That could have sunk the whole project had Chris Hecker and his group not been able to kind of crack that nut.
There were software packages out there that could take an animation and extrapolate it and take it from one 3D package and put it into another 3D package form, but there wasn't anything really like make an animation and then it'll play on any kind of crazy character or creature. There was nothing like that. This was, you don't know who your actor is. It might have 8 arms, it might have 8 legs, it could have 3 heads, 7 mouths, we don't know. But you have to make an animation and a system that will accommodate whatever the character is, whatever the player comes up with, the animation has to work. So this is Spasm. This is the tool that we use every day to create the animations of the creatures in Spore. So on this standard sort of biped character, what you would do in order to animate it would be to grab one of what we call the end effectors. In this case, it would be the left hand, and you'd move it. And that's the way you would animate. And as you see, as I move that one, they all move. So if I took the character like this, rotate around him, and play an animation, this is one of our standard happy animations where you can see he does a little hop, and then he does a little laugh at the end. So we do this animation. It takes us a few hours to get something like this in place. Then the next step would be to do a lineup of characters and see how well this animation reads on the rest of them. So now we have this entire set of creatures, and as you can see, as you go down the line, there's some pretty goofy looking ones, multiple legs, maybe some really short tiny arms, maybe some really long arms, no arms at all. You have this, and then we play that same animation. Here's our original guy. You play that same animation on them, and you try to see, okay, can we tell that they're jumping? Can we tell that they're clapping? Can we tell that they're laughing? And for the most part, you can see as you go down the line, well, yeah, they're all pretty much doing this motion, and they're doing it pretty well, and it's readable. So this would be considered a successful animation.
Fun thing about Will is that the challenges that he presents aren't just the challenges that you've already solved 100 times in other games. They're really weird and new challenges, and coming up with good answers for them is is the essence of creativity.
Spore was a very challenging project because we were trying to innovate in so many dimensions at once. There was a lot of innovative design involved, a lot of, fairly deep technology. Huge challenges in terms of we had all these different genres of gameplay that you go through across the levels, but yet we wanted to have the player to feel like it was the same game. Roughly the way the controls worked and the camera and the interface had to feel fairly consistent across levels, even though we're dealing with things like first-person eaters, like a first-person shooter, RTS, Pac-Man, all these different genres have to feel, basically live under the same control system.
We did have 5 different games of really different styles, and making sure that the player experienced it as this overall journey, that they were taking their creation from cell to creature, tribe, civ, and ultimately into a spacefaring race. That was a unique challenge because we had come up with different genres.
Getting that aesthetic smoothness that you could normally kind of take for granted when you have complete control over every aspect of the game, and suddenly your player actually has most of the control. It's quite challenging.
So Spore is a world where there's lots of different colors. Of course, the player can decide that they want to have a very colorful creature, the player can decide they want to have a gray creature. And so you've got kind of open-ended color choices that the player is making at every stage of the game. But all this has to sort of blend together into one coherent world. And so we spent all this time making it so that the skies had sort of these beautiful colors that were informed by the color of the sun. So you'd have the sun up there, and then you'd get this glow of sunlight through the atmosphere, and that would tint and diffuse through the land, and so the land would blend into the color of the sky. And then the creatures who are walking around, if they're purple, if they're green, if they're gray, it wouldn't make much difference, would all be lit properly by sort of the golden light of sunset, for example, or the bluish light of midnight. And so no matter what choices the player makes in terms of color, we had to make sure that they all integrated cleanly into the color palettes of the worlds.
We knew that basically almost everything in the game wanted to have a procedural or generative basis, so the computer could create animations, planets, models. One of the things that I thought was just kind of out of the realm of possibility for us was having the computer compose the music procedurally on the fly. And that was something about halfway through the project. Brian Eno came on, got involved, and he was kind of like the key to that, and so we actually ended up achieving that as well.
Brian Eno came in about 2 years ago in the project, and he came in right at a really great point when we had just gotten sort of into place some of the technical tools we use to write the music in real time. And so when he first arrived, he spent about a week here, would make amazing sounds, and we would sample them and get them playing back, and Will and Brian and I would all sort of just be, hunched over the computer for a while and coming up with ideas. Yeah, all the voices of the creatures are determined by the mouth that you place on the creature, and also the sort of the intelligence level of the creature. So, and the main chunk of the voice work was focused in creature game, and there's 10 sort of rows of mouths you can choose from. And then on top of that, they also scale their sounds based on how large or small you make that mouth part. So if you place on a bird part and scale it very large, you get a deeper sounding creature.
The Sims players were browsing the web to find content to download in their games, and Spore is actually part of the gameplay, that you fly around and you actually encounter stuff that other players have made, making the creativity part of the gameplay. So as you play the game, you are automatically creating new life forms, new civilizations, etc., that automatically get shared with other players. You don't have to go out to an external website and download it and then reboot the game up. It's just part of the kind of game loop.
There will be millions and millions of pieces of user-generated content, and the content is so vast. There's just this huge amount that we need to organize, because any one viewer is never going to see all of the content that's ever created for Spore.
I think Will says you can play it for about 70 years and never see the same planet. The Sporepedia is your multi-purpose asset browser. Basically, it's the place in the game that you're going to interact with the community. It's the place that you're going to interact with all of the creations that you've downloaded, all the creations that Maxis has made.
This is sort of the encyclopedia of everything that's been created in Spore and everything you have in your game.
So one of the great things about the Sporepedia is when you're in the midst of your game and you come across another creature and you want to have more information about it, you can just hit a key and bring up Sporepedia and get all of the information about that creature. You can comment on other people's creations. You can look at their creature or their building, whatever, in their Sporepedia card, and then there's an area for you to make comments, and it can be displayed on their card for anyone to see. So that's kind of a fun way that users can interact with each other in the massively single-player universe of Spore.
We have this idea that the way that users can get the best content is by using the collaborative player consciousness to find the best content, because there's going to be a lot of content that people make. So we've put in these tools that allow the actual user community to tell us what they think is the best. So we've put in keyword tags that people can search for things that are over certain themes and find groupings, like help get a smaller window into that vast world of content.
So one of the things you can do with the Sporepedia is create something called a Sporecast, which is basically a collection of assets that all form a certain theme. So, somebody could make an entire Sporecast that's all edible food or puppies or anything you can imagine. And then you'll be able to play a game of Spore using that Sporecast. So everything you see in that game will be coming from that feed.
I see Spore as having 3 equal parts. One part is creating things, one part is sharing things, and the other part is playing with those things. I think the important thing to remember about Spore is it's not a game with creativity tacked on the side. It's creativity and a game at the same time, and then sharing as a core preset. It's going to be very interesting to see people's reactions when we ship it, because that's an unusual layout for a game.
We're really just getting to that first wave of what Spore is all about. Because it's so much about those creativity tools and about that sharing, we fully expect that this thing really just starts to have a life when we ship.
Once you've given the player the means to create these wonderful little toys, they're going to want to do a million other things with them. And so we're going to be spending a bunch of our time, I'm sure, coming up with new ways that players can play with the stuff that they've created, potentially outside of the context of the game of Spore.
It's going to be crazy when the game ships, and I know that on day one of ship day, I will be sitting on our website, hitting refresh, and waiting to see what crazy stuff comes up.
My thought is I'm going to stand outside stores with a Sharpie and offer to sign copies of Spore.
The 8th of September, I have made my team promise me that we are going to be somewhere in Mexico on a beach drinking heavily.
Personally, I hope people just enjoy it. I feel like we've put a lot of stuff on the table, and I hope people just pick up parts of it and enjoy that experience.
Definitely there's a big anticipation. I'm really curious as to what the world will think of it. There's been a lot of hype and anticipation around the game, so that's a little scary, but I think there's so much creativity and fun to be had in Spore that it can't be anything but a hit.
There are people in the office who've been working on this game on and off for 7 or 8 years, and I've never worked in a game where that's been the case.
By the time Spore ships, I will have been on Spore longer than I was in high school. I will almost have been on Spore longer than I was in college. And I was in college for a long time.
When you work on a project that goes over a long period of time and you have a group of people together for a series of time, one of the things that we expect to be putting in the credits is how many Spore babies have been born during the production of Spore. At last count, gosh, I think we're up to 7 or 8.
One person has had 2 babies. I know of several engagements, 5 or 6 weddings.
I've been on it long enough. I've been on this project long enough that any kid that was born early on is probably already in kindergarten or 1st grade. And
so usually when I get near the end of a project, I get distracted, start thinking about, what am I going to do next, or what other ideas, because there's really no lack of ideas. I've never had that problem at all. It's lack of time to pursue ideas.
Will has, and he still has, the idea of doing a live stage production based on Spore. So imagine a giant dome with actors playing the part of an evolving Spore species. Will loves that idea. It's a musical, and I think it's going to happen.